It's May 16th, 2026. Welcome to yes2hellwith.com. Today we examine one of the least discussed but most powerful forces inside the justice system, and that is institutional prestige. Most Americans do not walk into court believing that the FBI failed to investigate, that prosecutors failed to verify, or banks supplied inaccurate narratives, or federal agencies ignored contradictions. Most Americans assume that the government checked, and that assumption changes everything. Once institutional prestige enters the courtroom, the burden often begins shifting psychologically before trial ever starts. Jurors trust federal agents. Jurors trust prosecutors. Jurors trust banks. Jurors trust institutional records. And that trust can become part of the prosecution structure itself. But prestige is not proof. Authority is not proof. Credentials are not proof. Institutional confidence is not proof. Yet those things can begin substituting for independent structural verification. Think about how this operates psychologically. If jurors believe the FBI already verified the records and prosecutors already authenticated the obligation, and the bank's narrative was independently tested, then many jurors begin treating the underlying structure as established before the defense even speaks. That is the power of institutional prestige. And that prestige became critically important when contradictions emerged in the Carter case. The OCC confirmed there was no $4 million loan. PNC stated that it never asserted the $4 million loan. The shredding explanation collapsed under FOIA review. Yes, the Executive Office of United States Attorneys confirmed that Glassman lied. The obvious public question should have become, how did this happen? But institutional continuity prevented meaningful re-examination. Why? Because once federal institutions publicly commit to a narrative, reversing course becomes institutionally crippling. That is where prestige becomes self-protective. Prestige does not merely influence jurors. Prestige influences institutions themselves. Investigators trust prior investigators. Prosecutors trust prior prosecutors. Courts trust the courts. Agencies trust agencies. And eventually, institutional trust begins replacing independent structural verification. That is the deeper issue. Later, prosecutors inherited more than a case file. They received judicial findings, agency conclusions, courtroom narratives, and appellate history. And once those things accumulate, the pressure to preserve continuity becomes enormous. This series is not about arguing that all institutions are dishonest. The issue is structural. The issue is whether institutional prestige creates environments where presumptions become difficult to challenge once official agencies adopt them. That is precisely the concern here. By the time later contradictions emerged, multiple institutions had already committed themselves publicly to the original prosecution's narrative. At that point, truth itself became dangerous to the institution. Think carefully about what that means. Once institutions publicly embrace a conclusion, admitting foundational error threatens careers, agency credibility, public trust, prior rulings, and institutional legitimacy itself. That institutional pressure became more important than independently revisiting the prosecution's very foundation. Now, this becomes critically important because the next episode examines the mechanism through which these assumptions harden permanently into institutional reality. The string of illusions is what we call it. The progression followed from bank to investigator to prosecutor to courtroom to appellate system. And it became institutional permanence. solidified, fossilized. And once that progression completed itself, the presumptions became extraordinarily difficult to challenge. In the next episode, the string of illusions. And as always, may truth reign supreme.